On a very hot July afternoon in 1975, a dark red car pulled into the parking lot of the Mashus Red Fox restaurant in Detroit. Jimmy Hoffa, one of the most powerful union leaders in American history, opened the back door and climbed inside. He was never seen again, but many years later, a dying man would admit to pulling the trigger, a truth that would shock the world of crime. This is the story of Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, a soldier, a hitman, a friend, and someone who turned on a friend. Before we start this amazing true story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Put a comment below and let me know. And if you are ready to go on a trip through one of the most interesting gangster stories ever told, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who loves true crime. Trust me, you will not want to miss a single part of this story. Now, let's begin. Francis Joseph Sheeran was born on October 25, 1920, in the working-class town of Darby, Pennsylvania, a rough town near Philadelphia, where big factory smokestacks filled the sky and the air smelled like factories. He was born into an Irish-American and Swedish-American family. That was a good example of immigrant life in early 20th century America. Hardworking, Catholic, and having a hard time getting by in a world that did not promise much and gave even fewer chances to get ahead. His father was a house painter, a job that needed to be strong, have steady hands, and be willing to work in all kinds of weather for money that was just enough to keep the family fed and in their home. The older Sheeran was a hard man, made that way by the tough money problems of his time, and he was set on raising sons who could survive in a world that did not show any kindness to weak people. His way of making young Frank tough was direct and did not bend. He would make the boy put on boxing gloves and fight him. These were not fun play fights between a father and son. They were real fights with real punches, where a boy learned that pain was just a part of life, and that the only way to survive was to hit back, to never show you were weak, and to never let anyone see you cry. Frank would later remember these fights with a mix of anger and some respect. His father was teaching him lessons that would help him in the world he would later join. Lessons about violence, being in control, and the simple math of power. The Sheeran home was Catholic in the strict, unforgiving way of that time. Going to church on Sunday was a must. The ideas of sin, telling your sins to a priest, and being forgiven were a part of everyday life. Young Frank learned about right and wrong, about big sins and small sins, about the promise of heaven and the threat of hell. These teachings would create a way of thinking that would bother him for the rest of his life. A way of thinking where terrible things could be done, told to a priest and maybe forgiven, only to be done again in a never-ending circle of sin and trying to be forgiven. Growing up in the Depression era, Darby meant growing up hard. The neighborhood was full of families, just like the Sheerans, Irish, Italian, Polish, German immigrants, and their children, all fighting for the same few jobs, all struggling to keep their pride while being very poor. Street fights were normal. Being loyal to your own group of people was the most important thing. You learned quickly who your friends were and who your enemies were. And you learned that sometimes the line between friend and enemy could change with scary speed. Frank went to Catholic school, where strict nuns kept order with rulers and mean words. School was important, but skills for staying alive were more important. The boys in Frank's neighborhood did not dream of becoming doctors or lawyers. Those jobs were for children born into different situations, children whose fathers wore suits instead of paint-stained work clothes. The boys of Darby dreamed smaller dreams, a steady job, enough money to take care of a family, and maybe a house of their own someday. But Frank Sheeran had things about him that made him different from the other boys. He was tall, eventually growing to a big 6 feet 4 inches, with wide shoulders and large, powerful hands. He had a natural strong look that made other boys think twice before fighting him. More importantly, he had learned what psychologists would later call a skill for controlled violence. The boxing matches with his father had taught him not just how to fight, but how to separate his feelings from the violence. He could hurt someone without losing his temper, without letting anger make him think unclearly. This skill of being able to hurt someone in a calm, step-by-step way would become one of his most useful skills in the years to come. As Frank went through his teenage years in the late 1930s, the world around him was changing in ways both small and big. Europe was moving toward war. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was gaining power and beginning to carry out his twisted idea of a pure race. In the Pacific, Japan was spreading its powerful goals across Asia. And in the United States, the long dark time of the Great Depression was finally starting to end, replaced by a growing feeling that America might soon be pulled into the fights that were taking over the rest of the world. For young men like Frank Sheeran, the Army offered something that regular life could not: a clear goal, steady pay, and the chance to prove yourself in the most basic way possible, in a fight. The U.S. Army was getting bigger, getting ready for a war that seemed more and more likely to happen. Army recruiters were busy in working-class neighborhoods like Derby, promising adventure, honor, and the chance to serve your country. In August 1941, at the age of 20, Frank Sheeran made a choice that would change the path of his whole life. He walked into a recruiting office and joined the United States Army. He finished his basic training near Biloxi, Mississippi, in the sticky heat of the Gulf Coast, where drill sergeants broke down soft regular people and rebuilt them as soldiers. Frank got used to Army life surprisingly easily. He liked the rules, the clear line of command, the focus on loyalty and following orders, and the physical challenges. All of it felt normal to a young man who had been made tough by years of fighting his father in their living room. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor in a shocking surprise attack that killed thousands of American soldiers and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to Congress and the country, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. America was at war. Frank Sheeran volunteered for airborne training, wanting the special status and extra pay that came with being a paratrooper. He went to Fort Benning, Georgia, where soldiers learned to jump from planes and fight behind enemy lines. But fate stepped in. During training, Sheeran hurt his shoulder, an injury that ended his hopes of joining the airborne. Instead, he was sent to the 45th Infantry Division, a group that would soon get two nicknames that showed how fierce it was in a fight: the Thunderbirds and the Killer Division. The 45th Infantry Division had a proud history, having been made from National Guard groups from Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Its shoulder patch had a yellow Thunderbird on a red background, a Native American sign that meant power and strength. But it would be the division's record in battle, not its patch, that would make its reputation. As Frank Sheeran got ready to go to war, he was still the same working-class kid from Derby in some ways. He was okay with violence, but not yet the tough killer he would become. The war would change that. It would take away whatever innocence was left and replace it with something darker, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On July 14, 1943, Frank Sheeran got on a troop ship and sailed from the United States, heading for North Africa. He was 22 years old. He had never been outside Pennsylvania before he joined the Army. Now he was heading to a war zone on the other side of the world, part of an American military machine that was finally beginning to win against the Axis powers. The trip across the Atlantic was long and not comfortable. Thousands of soldiers were packed into the ship's lower decks, sleeping in beds stacked 4 high, breathing old air thick with the smell of sweat and vomit from soldiers who were seasick. German U-boats roamed the Atlantic, looking for allied groups of ships. Every man on board knew that at any moment a torpedo could rip through the ship and send them to the bottom of the ocean. But the trip went by without any problems, and eventually the shores of North Africa appeared. By the time Sheeran arrived, the fight in North Africa was almost over. Allied armies under British General Bernard Montgomery and American General Dwight D. Eisenhower had pushed German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps into a smaller and smaller area. The fighting was tough desert war under a hot sun, where water was as important as bullets, and men died from the heat as often as from enemy bullets. Sheeran's first time in a real fight came quickly. The 45th Infantry Division was immediately put into combat, and Frank learned the basic lessons that would keep him alive. Keep your head down, follow orders without stopping to think, trust the men in your group, and learn how to kill without thinking too much about it. But it was the fight in Italy that would truly change Frank Sheeran from a soldier into something else, something harder and colder, something that could do extreme violence without any emotional effects. The Allied attack on Sicily began on July 10, 1943, just days before Sheeran arrived in the Mediterranean area. Operation Husky, as it was called, was the largest attack from the sea of the war up to that point. The 45th Infantry Division was part of the attacking army, given the job of taking a beach and then moving inland against German and Italian defenders. Sheeran walked ashore under enemy fire, his boots sinking into wet sand as machine gun bullets made sprays of water shoot up around him. Men fell dead and hurt in the waves. The noise was deafening. The roar of Navy guns giving cover fire, the scream of incoming artillery, the fast tapping sound of machine guns, and above it all, the screams of hurt men calling for medics. But Sheeran did not freeze. The training took over. He moved forward, found cover, and fired back. He survived his first day of combat, then his second, then his third. Days turned into weeks as the 45th Infantry Division fought its way across Sicily, getting into fierce battles for every town and hilltop. In September 1943, the division took part in the attack on mainland Italy at Salerno. The Germans had expected the landing and were ready. The fighting was even heavier than in Sicily. For days, no one knew who would win because German counterattacks threatened to push the Allies back into the sea. But the beach was held, and the long, slow fight up the Italian peninsula began. The fight in Italy would become known for being very hard. The mountains made it easier for the defenders. The weather changed between burning summer heat and winter cold that turned the battlefield into a frozen hell. German armies, even though they were moving back, fought with skill and were determined, making the Allies pay for every mile they gained. Sheeran took part in the Anzio battle, one of the bloodiest parts of the whole Italian fight. The Allies had hoped that a landing from the sea behind German lines would break the tie. But instead, the landing army got trapped on the beach for months, being hit with constant artillery bombs and counterattacks. Soldiers called it the meat grinder. Men went crazy from the constant shelling. The number of people hurt and killed was shocking. Through all of it, Frank Sheeran kept fighting. He kept killing, and something inside him began to change. In total, Sheeran would serve an amazing 411 days of combat, more than 4 times the average soldier's 100 days of combat experience. 411 days of killing and watching men die. 411 days of sleeping in holes in the ground and ruined buildings. 411 days of wondering if each morning would be his last. The 45th Infantry Division fought through France after the Normandy invasion, took part in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate attack in the winter of 1944, and eventually crossed into Germany itself. By this point, Sheeran had become a skilled combat veteran, a man who could kill well and without stopping to think. But it was what happened in Germany that would be the darkest part of Sheeran's army service and plant the seeds for what he would become in his regular life. As Allied armies moved into Germany in the spring of 1945, they began to find out the full horror of the Nazi government. Concentration camps were freed, showing scenes of mass murder and planned killing of a whole race that shocked even tough combat veterans. The discovery of these camps created a rage among Allied soldiers, a desire for revenge against the Germans, who had done such terrible things. In his later confessions, Sheeran would claim that he took part in many mass killings and quick executions of German prisoners of war. These were not combat killings. These were war crimes, the planned murder of men who had given up and should have been protected under the rules of war. According to Sheeran, it was not unusual for officers to tell soldiers to take German prisoners back behind the lines with a knowing look and an order to hurry back. The hidden meaning was clear. The prisoners were not supposed to make it back. They were to be killed out of sight of the main army, their deaths blamed on the confusion of battle. Sheeran would later describe this time as the period when he learned to not care about taking a human life. He learned to kill without feeling anything, to see the act of murder as simply following orders, as just another job to be finished. The psychological distance he had learned as a child, the ability to hit someone without anger now, included the ultimate act of violence. He could kill a man without hate, without rage, without any feeling at all. This is the dark truth at the center of Frank Sheeran's story. The war did not just teach him how to kill. It taught him how to kill without a conscience. And when he returned to the United States after Germany's surrender in May 1945, he brought that lesson home with him. When Frank Sheeran stepped off the troopship onto American land, he was technically the same person who had left more than 2 years earlier. He had the same name, the same face, the same family waiting for him. But in every way that mattered, he was a different man. The young soldier who had sailed to North Africa still had some basic humanity, some core of goodness that set limits on what he was able to do. The man who returned had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. He had killed so many times that it had become a normal thing. He had learned to see human life as cheap, something you could get rid of, something that could be ended on orders without a second thought. Like millions of other returning veterans, Sheeran was let go from military service with an honorable discharge, a few medals, and the expectation that he would now go back to civilian life as if nothing had happened. The GI Bill offered chances for education and buying a home. The American economy was growing fast, changing from making things for war to making things for peacetime. There were plenty of jobs. The future seemed bright. But for men like Frank Sheeran, the change to civilian life was not smooth at all. How do you go from the intensity of combat to the boringness of everyday life? How do you explain to regular people what you have seen and done? How do you turn off the extreme watchfulness that kept you alive in combat, but now makes you jump at sudden noises and reach for guns that are not there? Sheeran did what many veterans did. He tried to build a normal life. He got married. He started a family. He looked for a steady job that would give him a good income. And he found a job as a truck driver, a job that suited him well. It was honest work. It needed long hours and hard labor, but it paid pretty well and offered a certain freedom. Behind the wheel of a truck, Sheeran could be alone with his thoughts, driving through the night on empty highways, delivering goods across Pennsylvania and the nearby states. For a while, it seemed like it might work. Sheeran was building the life that American society expected of him. Marriage, children, a working-class job, a simple home. He was trying to be a husband and a father. He was trying to leave the war behind. But the past has a way of not staying buried. The things Sheeran had done in Europe haunted him. The ease with which he could kill troubled him, even as he tried to push those memories away. And the civilian world, with its rules and expectations, felt like a cage to a man who had spent years living on the edge of death. More importantly, Frank Sheeran had skills that were valuable in a certain part of American society, a part that operated outside the law and had no problem using violence to get what it wanted. He was strong. He was scary. He could hurt people without hesitation or feeling bad about it. And in post-war Philadelphia, there were men who were always looking for people with exactly those qualities. The trucking industry in the 1940s and 1950s was heavily involved with organized crime. The Mafia realized early on that controlling transportation meant controlling business. And the Teamsters Union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, had become a key battleground in the fight for power. Mob figures were forcing their way into leadership positions in the union, using their control to demand money from businesses, rig contracts, and steal money from retirement funds. Frank Sheeran, driving his truck through the streets of Philadelphia and along the highways of the East Coast, was bound to come into contact with this world. And when he did, certain people noticed. Here was a man with military training, a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds, a man who had killed dozens of times and showed no signs of mental problems from it, a man who understood hierarchy and followed orders, a man who was struggling to make money and might be open to chances that offered better money than regular trucking work could provide. In the world of organized crime, men like Frank Sheeran were valuable. The Mafia needed muscle, enforcers who could scare, beat, and, if needed, kill. And unlike the Italian men, who were the main part of the Mafia, Irish enforcers like Sheeran had a certain advantage. They could operate in Irish neighborhoods without getting attention. And they were not held back by the ethnic rules that decided who could be a member of La Cosa Nostra. The chance came through the trucking world. Sheeran began doing small jobs. Nothing big at first, just little favors that brought in extra cash. Maybe he would help convince a shop owner to accept protection. Maybe he would beat up someone who owed money to the wrong people. Maybe he would use his truck to move goods that were better not looked at too closely by the police. Each step seemed small on its own. Each step seemed like just one more compromise, one more moral line crossed to feed his family and make ends meet. But each step also led, step by step, to the next, pulling Frank Sheeran deeper into a world from which there would be no escape. The war had taught Frank Sheeran how to kill. The streets of Philadelphia would teach him how to make a profit from that skill. And the man who would help him fully change from a working class truck driver to a mob enforcer was waiting just around the corner. A short, soft-spoken Italian named Russell Bufalino, who would become the most important person in Frank Sheeran's criminal life. The choice was made. The path was set. Frank Sheeran was about to enter the world of crime. And once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Russell Bufalino was not a scary-looking man. He was barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, with thinning hair and the kind of face that could fit into any crowd. He wore simple suits and spoke in a quiet voice. He could have been a shopkeeper or an accountant, or any of 1,000 other normal middle-aged men doing normal business in the cities and towns of Pennsylvania. But Russell Bufalino was none of those things. He was one of the most powerful organized crime leaders in the United States, the boss of a crime family that controlled criminal activities from Scranton to Buffalo, from the coal areas of northeastern Pennsylvania to the labor unions that were in charge of industries across the state. The Bufalino crime family was not as famous as New York's Five Families or the Chicago outfit, but in many ways, that was exactly the point. Bufalino preferred to work quietly, building relationships with politicians, judges, and union leaders while avoiding the immediate attention that bothered more flashy mob figures. He was a chess player, always thinking several moves ahead, building power through patience and smart partnerships rather than big shows of violence. The exact story of Frank Sheeran's first meeting with Russell Bufalino has been told in slightly different ways in different places, but the main facts are clear. Sometime in the early 1950s, while working as a truck driver, Sheeran got the attention of Pennsylvania's most powerful crime boss. Bufalino's interest in Sheeran was easy to understand. The crime boss was always looking for reliable men who could handle difficult situations. Men who were not Italian and therefore could work more freely. Men who had proven they could be violent. And men who understood loyalty and the importance of keeping their mouths shut. Frank Sheeran fit all those descriptions. His Irish background meant he was not tied to the ethnic rules of La Cosa Nostra, but could still work closely with Italian mobsters. His military service had proven his courage and his ability to kill. His working-class background meant he understood the world Bufalino worked in, the world of unions and trucking companies and construction sites, where cash was passed around and favors were traded. Most importantly, Sheeran had a quality that Bufalino valued more than almost anything else. He could be trusted to follow orders without asking too many questions. When Bufalino told Sheeran to do something, Sheeran did it. No hesitation, no thinking about right or wrong, no second guessing, just cold, efficient action. The relationship began simply enough. Bufalino would give Sheeran small jobs, deliver a message, collect a debt, remind someone that they had promises to keep. Sheeran did these jobs well and without complaining. The money was good, much better than what he could make as a regular truck driver. And the work, while sometimes unpleasant, was not very difficult for a man with Sheeran's skills. But Russell Bufalino was testing Frank Sheeran, figuring out if this scary Irishman could be trusted with more serious jobs. And soon the test would come. According to Sheeran's later confessions, his first murder for organized crime was a gangster nicknamed Whispers DiTullio. The story of this killing shows a lot about how the world of crime worked and how Frank Sheeran became permanently caught in its trap. DiTullio had offered Sheeran a job, destroy the Cadillac linen service in Delaware, and get $10,000, a lot of money in the 1950s. On the surface, it seemed like a simple criminal job. Linen services were often fronts for organized crime. Fights over who controlled such businesses often ended in fires, damage, or violence. What Sheeran did not know, or what DiTullio had not mentioned, was that Angelo Bruno, the powerful boss of the Philadelphia crime family, had a money interest in Cadillac linen service. By attacking that business, Sheeran had accidentally attacked a business protected by the Mafia. And in the world of La Cosa Nostra, such a mistake had to be punished. When Russell Bufalino found out what had happened, he had a problem. Frank Sheeran had made a mistake against Angelo Bruno, one of Bufalino's closest partners. The mistake could not go unpunished. If it did, it would make Bufalino look weak and would hurt his relationship with Bruno. But Bufalino also saw potential in Sheeran and did not want to lose a promising soldier. The solution was cruel but smart. Whispers, DiTullio had to die. He was the one who had set up the job without getting it approved properly. He was the one who had put Sheeran in a no-win situation. And if Frank Sheeran wanted to stay on Russell Bufalino's good side, if he wanted to stay alive himself, he would be the one to pull the trigger. This was more than just a test. It was a first step. It was Russell Bufalino's way of tying Frank Sheeran to him through blood and being part of the crime. Once Sheeran committed this murder, there would be no going back to a normal life. He would be a killer working for the Mafia, and his future would be forever tied to the Bufalino crime family. Sheeran accepted the job. He found Whispers DiTullio, and he killed him. The details of that killing have been lost over time. Sheeran never gave a detailed story of how it was done, where he found DiTullio, what weapon he used, or whether DiTullio saw it coming or was surprised. But the act itself was clear. Frank Sheeran committed his first murder for organized crime, crossing a line that separated him forever from law-abiding society. In return, he received Russell Bufalino's trust and support. He became a made associate of the Bufalino crime family. Not a full member, since his Irish background prevented him from being formally in La Cosa Nostra, but a valued and trusted soldier who would receive protection, opportunities, and a way to use the power that the Mafia controlled. The relationship between Bufalino and Sheeran would last for decades. Bufalino would become a father figure to Sheeran, a teacher who guided his rise in the world of crime and eventually introduced him to the man who would define the rest of his life, Jimmy Hoffa. But before we can fully understand that important introduction, we need to understand the world of the Teamsters Union, the world of using unions for crime and corruption that created opportunities for men like Frank Sheeran to gain wealth and power far beyond what their working-class backgrounds would have otherwise allowed. The year was 1957, and the American labor movement was at the peak of its power. Unions represented millions of workers in almost every industry. They negotiated for wages and benefits, fought for safety rules in the workplace, and had a huge amount of political power. And no union was more powerful than the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The Teamsters represented truck drivers, warehouse workers, and other transportation workers, workers who were the essential backbone of American business. Without trucks moving goods from factories to stores, the entire economy would stop. The Teamsters understood this power and used it cruelly to get what they wanted from employers. But by the 1950s, the Teamsters had become something else as well, a way for organized crime to get into legitimate business and steal millions of dollars in illegal profits. Mob figures had gotten positions of power within the union leadership, using their positions to demand money from businesses, accept bribes, and make special deals that helped criminals at the cost of regular workers. And at the center of this mix of labor, crime, and power stood James Riddle Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, a man whose ambition, cruelty, and brilliant plans made him both one of the most effective labor leaders in American history and one of the most corrupt. Hoffa had risen up in the Teamsters through a mix of real organizing skill and a willingness to use violence and fear. He understood that power in the labor movement came from controlling local unions, controlling retirement funds, and controlling the power to strike. And he was willing to make deals with organized crime to get and keep that control. Russell Bufalino had a long-time relationship with Jimmy Hoffa. They were both practical men who understood that working together could help both the Mafia and the Teamsters. Hoffa needed muscle to scare rival union leaders and keep unruly local unions in line. The Mafia needed to get money from the Teamsters' retirement funds for loans to pay for their operations. It was a relationship where they both helped each other, built on their own self-interest, and sealed with handshakes in smoky rooms. In 1957, Russell Bufalino decided it was time to introduce Frank Sheeran to Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa had a problem. Rival groups within the Teamsters were challenging his power, and some of these rivals needed to be dealt with for good. He needed a reliable killer, someone with no connection to the Teamsters, who could get rid of threats without bringing attention to Hoffa himself. The introduction happened over the phone. Bufalino set up a call between Hoffa and Sheeran, and when Hoffa's voice came on the line, he spoke words that would become famous decades later, remembered in the title of Charles Brandt's book and Martin Scorsese's movie. "I heard you paint houses," Hoffa said. It was Mafia code, a secret way of talking that everyone in organized crime understood. Painting houses meant killing people, a reference to the blood splatter that would stain walls when someone was shot. It was Hoffa's way of asking, without directly asking, if Frank Sheeran was a hitman. Sheeran's answer was also in code and just as clear. "Yeah, and I do my own carpentry too." Carpentry meant getting rid of bodies. Sheeran was telling Hoffa that he did not just kill people. He also cleaned up afterward, making sure bodies disappeared and investigations went nowhere. He was a full-service killer, able to handle every part of a murder, from planning to killing to getting rid of the evidence. Jimmy Hoffa liked what he heard, and so began a relationship that would last nearly 2 decades. A relationship built on violence, loyalty, and helping each other. But in the end, ending in the ultimate betrayal. Frank Sheeran's rise in the world of organized crime and labor corruption happened much faster after he met Jimmy Hoffa. Under Hoffa's support and Russell Bufalino's guidance, Sheeran became a key person in one of the most corrupt times in American labor history. Hoffa arranged for Sheeran to become president of the Delaware Teamsters Local 326, a local union that Hoffa basically created just for Sheeran by taking it from the existing Philadelphia Local 107. This was not a fair election or a recognition of real labor organizing. It was a perfect example of how the mob infiltrated Teamsters worked. Positions of power within the union were given as rewards to loyal enforcers, giving them a real job to hide their criminal activities and access to union resources that could be used for their own gain. As president of Local 326, Sheeran had a salary, an office, and what looked like a legitimate job. He could act like a labor leader fighting for workers' rights. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Frank Sheeran was Jimmy Hoffa's enforcer in Delaware and the areas around it, and his main job was to get rid of Hoffa's enemies and keep rebellious union members in line. The number of bodies began to grow. According to Sheeran's own later confessions, he killed between 25 and 30 people for Jimmy Hoffa during the 1960s and 1970s, though he claimed he could not remember the exact number. A scary fact that shows how normal murder had become for him. These were not killings in the middle of a war. These were planned murders of specific people whom Hoffa wanted dead. The victims included rival union officials who challenged Hoffa's power, businessmen who refused to work with the Teamsters' demands, and criminals who had betrayed the mob or knew too much. Some killings were carefully planned, with Sheeran watching the person and waiting for the right moment. Others were more sudden, decided in a phone call, and done within hours. Sheeran would later describe the casual way this violence happened with a disturbing, matter-of-fact tone. "I killed 3 people in one day, and then met up with Jimmy to give him the report," he told Charles Brandt. "It was just business, nothing personal, just jobs to be finished and reported like any other job duty." The relationship between Hoffa and Sheeran went beyond just an employer and an employee. They developed a real friendship, or at least the closest thing to friendship that men in their positions could have. Hoffa trusted Sheeran in ways he did not trust most people. He relied on Sheeran not just for muscle, but for company. They traveled together, ate meals together, and spent countless hours in each other's company. For Sheeran, Hoffa became something like a substitute father, a man who had given him opportunities, wealth, and a position far beyond what his working-class background would have otherwise provided. Hoffa had seen potential in the tall Irishman from Pennsylvania and had raised him to positions of real power within the Teamsters' empire. This makes what would eventually happen between them all the more sad, or, depending on how you look at it, all the more expected, because in the world of organized crime, friendship is always second to business. Loyalty is not guaranteed, and even the closest relationships can be ended when they become a problem. But in the 1960s, those dark days were still in the future. In the 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa seemed like he could not be beaten. He had strengthened his control over the Teamsters, fighting off challenges from groups trying to reform the union and from federal investigators who suspected corruption but could not quite prove it. The Teamsters Retirement Fund had become like a piggy bank for organized crime. with millions of dollars in loans going to mob-controlled businesses, especially in Las Vegas, where the Mafia was building a casino empire in the Nevada desert. Frank Sheeran's importance in this organization was huge. He was not just another mob enforcer. He was a high-ranking Teamsters official with real authority. He was a bridge between the Italian Mafia families and the Irish and other ethnic criminals who could not be formal members of La Cosa Nostra. And he was a killer of such cold efficiency that even tough mobsters spoke of him with respect. His reputation grew so much that in 1985, U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani would name Frank Sheeran as one of only 2 non-Italians on a list of 26 top mob figures targeted in a massive RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, prosecution. To be included on such a list, to be recognized as standing alongside bosses and leaders of the 5 families, was a sign of Sheeran's real importance in the American Mafia structure. The 1960s and early 1970s were the peak of both Hoffa's power and Sheeran's criminal career. But dark clouds were gathering and threatened this empire of corruption. The federal government, led by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, had made destroying Jimmy Hoffa and breaking the Teamsters Mafia connection a top priority. Investigators were building cases, getting witnesses to talk, and slowly but surely gathering evidence that would eventually bring down the whole corrupt system. And Frank Sheeran, standing at the center of Teamsters power and Mafia violence, would find himself caught in the middle when everything eventually came crashing down. Frank Sheeran's confessions to Charles Brandt in the last years of his life went beyond his work for Jimmy Hoffa and included claims about being involved in some of the most famous murders in American criminal history. These claims are among the most debated parts of Sheeran's story, with historians, journalists, and police officials arguing fiercely about whether they are true. On April 7, 1972, one of the most amazing mob hits in New York City history happened at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. Joey Gallo, nicknamed Crazy Joe, was celebrating his birthday with his wife, daughter, and several friends when gunmen burst into the restaurant and opened fire. Gallo was hit multiple times and died on the street outside the restaurant, his blood making a pool on the cobblestones of Mulberry Street. The Gallo murder had been expected. Joey Gallo had been at war with the Colombo crime family. And just weeks earlier, a gunman had shot Colombo family boss Joe Colombo at an Italian-American unity rally in Columbus Circle, leaving Colombo in a state where he could not move or think, from which he would never recover. Many believed Gallo had ordered that hit, and the Colombo family was determined to get revenge. In his confessions to Charles Brandt, Frank Sheeran claimed he was one of the shooters who killed Joey Gallo at Umberto's. According to Sheeran, Russell Bufalino had asked him to take part in the hit as a favor to the Colombo family, and Sheeran had traveled to New York to do the job. But this claim is heavily argued against, perhaps more than any other part of Sheeran's confession. Multiple witnesses at Umberto's gave descriptions of the shooters that do not match Sheeran's physical appearance. At 6 feet 4 inches, Sheeran would have been impossible to miss. Yet no witness mentioned seeing anyone of that height. The bullet evidence, police reports, and what witnesses saw all point to other suspects. And most serious investigators of the Gallo murder dismiss Sheeran's claims as a made-up story to make himself seem more important. Bill Tonelli, in his article The Lies of the Irishman, published in Slate, carefully took apart Sheeran's claim to have killed Gallo, pointing out the many differences between Sheeran's story and the written evidence. Harvard Law School professor Jack Goldsmith, in his article Jimmy Hoffa and the Irishman, a true crime story, published in the New York Review of Books, also showed doubt about many of Sheeran's claims. Even more debated was Sheeran's claim about being involved in the killing of President John F. Kennedy. According to his confessions, The mob planned Kennedy's murder to get rid of the threat from attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of organized crime. Sheeran suggested he knew about this plan and may have played some part in helping it happen, though he never claimed to have been in Dallas on November 22, 1963, or to have been one of the shooters. This claim goes into the area of conspiracy theory that has surrounded the Kennedy assassination for decades. While it is historically true that the mob had reason to hate both Kennedy brothers John for the Bay of Pigs disaster that hurt their businesses in Cuba, and Robert for his fight against organized crime, there is no believable evidence to support the theory that the Mafia planned the assassination. The Warren Commission decided that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And while debates about the Kennedy assassination continue to this day, Sheeran's claims add little more than unprovable statements from a man who had clear reasons to make himself seem more important. These debated claims raise a very important question that haunts everything about Frank Sheeran's story. How much of what he said was true? And how much was the fantasy of a dying man trying to make his mark in history and provide for his family that had left him? Some of Sheeran's claims can be clearly checked. He was definitely a high-ranking Teamsters official. He definitely had close relationships with Russell, Bufalino, and Jimmy Hoffa. He was investigated by the FBI and eventually found guilty of using the union for crime. These facts are public records. But when it comes to specific murders, especially high-profile murders that caught the public's attention, the evidence becomes much less clear. Sheeran's confessions were made decades after the supposed events, when most of the other people involved were dead and could not confirm or deny his stories. He gave details that could have been learned from news reports or books, and he had strong financial reasons to make his story as dramatic and exciting as possible. A man who knew Sheeran personally told investigators that he never believed Sheeran killed a fly, suggesting that Sheeran's tough guy reputation might have been more myth than reality, or at least that his role as a killer might have been greatly exaggerated. Yet, it is also true that the FBI took Sheeran seriously. He appears in the Hoffa's memo, the FBI's full analysis of the Hoffa disappearance. Rudy Giuliani included him on that list of top mob figures. Law enforcement officials who investigated Teamsters, corruption and mob influence in the union consistently identified Sheeran as a significant player. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in the middle. Frank Sheeran was probably not the legendary hitman who killed 25 to 30 people and participated in some of the most famous mob murders of the 20th century. But he was also probably not an innocent union official who never hurt anyone. He was most likely a mob associate who committed some murders, served as an enforcer and intimidator, and played a genuine role in the corrupt connection between the Teamsters and organized crime, but who, in his final years, embellished and exaggerated that role to create a more dramatic story. The key question, of course, is whether he killed Jimmy Hoffa. That claim, unlike his claims about Gallo or Kennedy, is the centerpiece of his confessions and the focus of intense investigation. And to understand that claim, we need to understand what happened to Jimmy Hoffa in the early 1970s. When the empire he had built began to crumble and powerful men decided that Hoffa had become more valuable dead than alive. The start of Jimmy Hoffa's downfall can be traced to one man's obsessive determination, Robert F. Kennedy, as chief counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, commonly known as the McClellan Committee, in the late 1950s, and later as Attorney General under his brother President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy made destroying Jimmy Hoffa his personal mission. Kennedy believed correctly that Hoffa had turned the Teamsters into a criminal business, using union resources to make himself and his mob friends rich while betraying the needs of ordinary workers. The two men developed a bitter personal dislike for each other, trading insults in public and looking at each other with open contempt. Hoffa once told his friends he wanted to have Kennedy killed, though he was talked out of it by more careful mob figures who understood that murdering the Attorney General would bring down so much trouble that it would destroy everyone. The federal government's chase of Hoffa was non-stop. Investigators looked at every part of his money dealings, looking for evidence of corruption, extortion, and fraud. They pressured witnesses to testify against him. They wiretapped his phones and followed his movements. It was only a matter of time before they found something that would get him in trouble. The big break came with a case involving payoffs from car haul employers, companies that transported cars from factories to dealerships. Hoffa was accused of taking illegal payments from these employers in exchange for good union contracts. The trial began, and prosecutors were sure they would win. But Jimmy Hoffa had one more trick to play: jury tampering. He arranged for several jury members to be bribed, making sure that even if the evidence was overwhelming, the jury would be hung and unable to agree on a unanimous decision. The trick worked. The trial ended with a hung jury, and prosecutors had to declare a mistrial. However, federal investigators found evidence of the jury tampering, and this gave them the power they needed. Hoffa was charged with trying to corrupt the jury, and this time there would be no escape. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were believable, and Hoffa's usual bag of tricks could not save him. On March 4, 1964, Jimmy Hoffa was found guilty of jury tampering. He would eventually get a sentence of 13 years in federal prison, a huge blow to a man who had held enormous power just months earlier. More convictions for fraud and conspiracy added years to his sentence. By 1967, after trying all his appeals, Hoffa entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to begin serving his time. But even from prison, Hoffa tried to keep control of the Teamsters. He had put Frank Fitzsimmons, whom he saw as a loyal puppet, as the acting president of the union. Hoffa believed Fitzsimmons would keep his seat warm and step aside when he was eventually released. This would turn out to be a huge mistake. Frank Fitzsimmons had spent years in Hoffa's shadow, seen as a reliable but not very exciting worker. But once he got a taste of real power, Fitzsimmons had no plans to give it back. Also, he developed his own relationships with the mob families that had previously been loyal to Hoffa. He proved willing to be even more helpful to organized crime than Hoffa had been, approving loans from the Teamsters Retirement Fund with even less checking. The mob bosses realized that Fitzsimmons was easier to control than the changing and unpredictable Hoffa. Fitzsimmons did not have Hoffa's ego or ambition. He did not threaten to write tell-all books or hint at revealing mob secrets. He was happy to enjoy the benefits of his job while letting others pull the strings. From the mob's point of view, Frank Fitzsimmons was the perfect Teamsters president. Meanwhile, Hoffa was plotting in prison, trying to get himself released and planning his big return to power. And then, in a surprising turn of events, he found a helper: President Richard Nixon. Nixon had received a lot of financial support from the Teamsters in his 1972 re-election campaign. Also, according to Sheeran's later confessions, Hoffa had arranged for $500,000 in cash, money stolen from Las Vegas casinos, to be delivered to Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, as a bribe to get Hoffa released. Whether because of the bribe, the campaign money, or just a political decision, Nixon reduced Hoffa's sentence in December 1971, just before Christmas. After serving less than 5 years of his 13-year sentence, Jimmy Hoffa was a free man again. But his freedom came with a very important rule. He was not allowed to be involved in union activities until 1980. This rule, which may have been put in at the request of Frank Fitzsimmons and his mob supporters, meant that Hoffa could not just go back to his job as Teamsters president. He would have to wait nearly a decade before he could take back his throne. Jimmy Hoffa had no intention of waiting that long. Almost as soon as he was released, he began fighting to have the rule lifted. He hired lawyers to challenge it in court. He built relationships with political figures who might help him, and he made it clear to anyone who would listen that he planned to return to power at the Teamsters, with or without permission. This put Hoffa on a crash course with two powerful groups: Frank Fitzsimmons, who now had the job Hoffa wanted, and the mob families who preferred Fitzsimmons's easy-to-control nature to Hoffa's unpredictability. The time between Hoffa's release from prison in late 1971 and his disappearance in July 1975 was filled with growing tension and fear. Hoffa was like a caged tiger, desperate to get back the power that had been his identity for decades. But the world had changed while he was in prison, and many of the people who had once been loyal to him had found new deals that did not include him. Frank Sheeran found himself in an impossible situation. For nearly 2 decades, Jimmy Hoffa had been his protector, teacher, and friend. Hoffa had given Sheeran power, wealth, and status. But Sheeran's other protector, Russell Bufalino, was getting more and more worried about what Hoffa might do if he returned to power. The mob's fear was about several key things. First, there was the matter of the Teamsters Retirement Fund. Under Fitzsimmons's leadership, loans from the fund had paid for mob operations across the country, especially in Las Vegas, where millions of dollars had been invested in building and running casinos. These loans were made on very good terms, with little checking, and often were not expected to be paid back in full. It was basically free money for the mob. Hoffa had publicly criticized some of these loans, suggesting they were too risky and did not help the union members. The mob worried that if Hoffa returned to power, he might stop this flow of money, or worse, demand investigations into where the money had gone. Given Hoffa's changing moods and ego, he might even threaten to expose mob involvement if they did not support his return to power. Second, there was the question of what Hoffa knew and what he might tell. In 1972, Walter Sheridan's book about Teamsters corruption revealed that Hoffa had once worked as an FBI informant, giving information about the Teamsters president at the time, Dave Beck. This news was shocking to the mob. If Hoffa had been willing to inform on Beck, would he be willing to inform on others to get what he wanted? Could he be trusted to keep mob secrets? Or would he use his knowledge to get his way? Third, there was simply the matter of Hoffa's personality. He had always been stubborn, willing to take risks that more careful mob figures found scary. In prison, he had grown even more bitter and unpredictable. There were rumors that he was writing a book that might expose mob involvement in the Teamsters. Even if these rumors were not entirely true, they created an atmosphere of distrust. Russell Bufalino and other mob bosses began to have quiet talks about the Hoffa problem. Anthony Provenzano, a Teamsters official and a leader in the Genovese crime family who had once been close to Hoffa, had developed a bitter personal hatred for Hoffa after the two men fought in prison. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a powerful Detroit mob figure, also saw Hoffa as a threat to the profitable deals that had been set up while he was away. These men began to agree on something. Jimmy Hoffa could not be allowed to return to power at the Teamsters. But Hoffa was too famous, too well connected, and too determined to be easily stopped through legal or political ways. He was starting a serious campaign to have his union ban lifted, and he had enough support among the regular members that he might actually succeed. There was only one way to permanently solve the Hoffa problem. He would have to be killed. The decision was not made easily. Hoffa was a made associate of the mob, and killing such a high-profile person would bring a lot of attention from the police. But the bosses decided the risk of letting Hoffa live was greater than the risk of killing him. They would just have to be very careful about how they did it, and very careful about making sure the body was never found. For Frank Sheeran, This decision created a huge crisis. His loyalty was being pulled in two directions. On one side was Jimmy Hoffa, the man who had befriended him and raised him to positions of power. On the other side was Russell Bufalino, the man who had brought him into the mob and to whom he owed his main loyalty. In the world of organized crime, this was not really a choice at all. Bufalino was Sheeran's boss. The mob came first, always. Personal feelings did not matter. Loyalty to one person could never be more important than loyalty to the organization. And so, when Russell Bufalino told Frank Sheeran what needed to be done, Sheeran would do it, even if it meant killing the closest friend he had in the world. Even if it meant the betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. July 30th, 1975, started hot and sticky in the Detroit area. By early afternoon, the temperature had climbed to nearly 92 degrees under clear skies. It was the kind of heavy summer heat that made people look for air conditioning and wonder why anyone chose to live in the Midwest. Jimmy Hoffa had traveled to Detroit from his home in Lake Orion, Michigan, for what he believed would be an important meeting. He had been told that Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacolone wanted to sit down with him to discuss a peace agreement, a way to solve their problems and clear the way for Hoffa's return to the Teamsters leadership. It was the kind of meeting Hoffa had been trying to get for months, and even though some friends warned him it might be a trap, he decided to go. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the Masha's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, a fancy place known for its strict rule of wearing a coat and tie. But Hoffa arrived wearing dark blue plaid pants and a short-sleeve navy knit shirt, casual clothes that broke the restaurant's rule. This detail would later seem important to investigators, suggesting that either Hoffa did not plan to go inside or he knew the meeting would not actually happen at the restaurant itself. Hoffa arrived early and waited in the parking lot. He made several phone calls from a payphone, checking in with his wife and others, showing he was annoyed that the people he was supposed to meet had not arrived. Witnesses would later say they saw him walking back and forth in the parking lot, looking at his watch, clearly getting impatient as the minutes turned into an hour. According to Frank Sheeran's confession, the delay was on purpose. The plotters wanted to make sure everything was ready before picking up Hoffa. They wanted to be sure that the house where the murder would happen was empty, and that all the people involved were in place. Finally, around 2:45 p.m., a dark red 1975 Mercury Marquis pulled into the parking lot. The car was owned by Joey the Clown Giacolone, Anthony Giacolone's son, but was being driven that day by Charles Chucky O'Brien, a man Hoffa had known since childhood and treated almost like an adopted son. According to Sheeran's story, which has been confirmed in some details, but argued against in others, Sheeran himself was in that car, along with Salvatore Sallybugs Bergoglio, a mob enforcer. When Hoffa saw the car and recognized O'Brien, he had no suspicions. O'Brien was family. O'Brien was trustworthy. If O'Brien said they were going to meet Provenzano and Giacolone at a different place, Hoffa would believe him. Hoffa climbed into the back seat of the Mercury. The door closed, the car pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward Detroit, and Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again. What happened next is known only from Sheeran's confession, and this is where his story becomes the most argued about and most important. According to Sheeran, the car drove to a house in northwest Detroit in a working-class neighborhood where a murder could happen without getting too much attention. The house was a simple two-story home built in the 1920s. It was owned by Martha Sellers, a teacher in her 80s who was not living there all the time in 1975. According to later FBI investigations, there was a mysterious renter whom neighbors described as a real estater, someone involved in real estate who would sometimes disappear for long periods. This renter may have been the connection that gave the mob a way to use an empty house at the exact moment they needed it. Sheeran claimed that Hoffa was told they were stopping at the house to meet with Provenzano and Giacolone. Hoffa, trusting the men he was with, entered the house without any suspicion. Once inside, according to Sheeran, there was a short moment when Hoffa realized something was wrong, when he understood that he had been betrayed. And then Frank Sheeran raised a gun and shot Jimmy Hoffa twice in the back of the head. Sheeran would later tell Charles Brandt that he felt nothing when he pulled the trigger. Years of killing, starting with the war and continuing through decades of mob work, had taken away his ability to feel any emotion about violence. It was just another job. Another order followed. Another body to get rid of. When it's time for you to go, Sheeran explained, they'll send your best friend. After the shooting, according to Sheeran, the body was wrapped and removed from the house. Sheeran claimed Hoffa was cremated, his ashes scattered in a way that would make sure no trace of him would ever be found. The house was cleaned, the evidence removed, and the plotters went their separate ways to create alibis. The plan had worked perfectly, almost. Because while the body was never found, and no one was ever charged with the murder, investigators would eventually gather enough evidence to piece together most of what had happened that day. When Jimmy Hoffa did not come home on the evening of July 30th, his wife, Josephine, knew right away that something was terribly wrong. Hoffa was always on time and reliable about calling home. When he did not answer his phone and did not show up for dinner, she called the police. The investigation into Hoffa's disappearance would become one of the biggest in FBI history. Agents spread out across the Detroit area, talking to witnesses, looking at phone records, and following every clue. The case was given the code name Hoffex, a mix of Hoffa and extortion, and would take up thousands of hours of investigative work over the following years. One of the first big breaks came from the parking lot witnesses. Many people confirmed seeing Hoffa waiting at the Mashus Red Fox restaurant. Several remembered seeing him make phone calls and check his watch. The timeline of where he was that afternoon was set with pretty good certainty up until the moment a dark red Mercury Marquis arrived at the parking lot. Investigators quickly identified the car. It belonged to Joey Giacolone, and Chucky O'Brien had borrowed it that day. When questioned, O'Brien denied being at the restaurant and denied seeing Hoffa, but there was a problem with his denial. The evidence proved him wrong. Police brought in bloodhounds trained to track human scent. When the dogs were given items with Hoffa's scent and then allowed to check the mercury, they immediately showed a match on the rear seat. Hoffa had been in that car. There was no doubt. Years later, in 2001, forensic investigators would find a hair in the car. DNA testing confirmed it was Jimmy Hoffa's hair. The physical evidence could not be denied. Hoffa had been in the back seat of that Mercury Marquis on July 30th, 1975. But where had the car taken him? And what had happened then? The FBI put together a full analysis of everything they knew about the case in a 1976 document known as the Hoffex Memo. This memo named several suspects in Hoffa's disappearance, including Anthony Provenzano, Anthony Giacolone, Salvatore Brigaglio, and Frank Sheeran. Sheeran was listed as a main suspect, someone who had the motive, means, and opportunity to murder Hoffa. Investigators knew about Sheeran's relationship with both Hoffa and Russell Bufalino. They knew he was a violent enforcer with a history of following orders without question, and they had information suggesting that Bufalino had ordered the hit and would have used someone he trusted completely to do it. But information and suspicion are not the same as proof. The FBI could not place Sheeran at the scene. They could not find witnesses who had seen him in Detroit that day. They had no physical evidence connecting him to the murder. And without a body, without a crime scene that could be definitely linked to Hoffa's death, there was no way to bring charges. Then, in 2004, a breakthrough. Charles Brandt's book, I Heard You Paint Houses was published, containing Frank Sheeran's detailed confession to killing Hoffa. In the book, Sheeran described not just the murder itself, but specific details about the location, a house in northwest Detroit where the killing had taken place. Acting on information from the book, the FBI got a search warrant for a house that matched Sheeran's description. In 2005, a forensic team went to the property with luminol and other tools designed to find traces of blood, even decades after a crime. The results were amazing. Investigators found 28 separate spots where luminol showed the presence of blood. The pattern was consistent with the shooting. Blood splatter on walls and the floor, showing that violence had happened in that house. The forensic team collected DNA samples from 2 of the blood spots, where enough material was left for testing. The results came back negative. The DNA did not match Jimmy Hoffa's genetic profile. On the surface, this seemed to clear the house and cast doubt on Sheeran's confession. But forensics experts pointed out several problems with coming to that conclusion. First, the testing was done 30 years after the murder, and DNA breaks down over time, especially in conditions that are not perfect for keeping it safe. Second, the blood spots tested might not have been Hoffa's blood. They could have been from one of the other people present during the murder, or from unrelated events before or after the killing. Third, the lack of positive DNA evidence is not the same as proof that Hoffa was not killed there. Moreover, other parts of Sheeran's story proved to be accurate. The house existed. It matched the description Sheeran had provided. The timeline he described was consistent with where Hoffa was known to be that day, and the presence of blood evidence in the house, even if not definitely Hoffa's, suggested that violence had indeed happened there. FBI agents who investigated the case remained divided on how believable Sheeran was. Some, like former FBI case agent Robert Garrity, expressed doubt, saying there was no real indication that Sheeran was even present on July 30th, 1975. But others found his confession convincing, especially the details he provided about the house layout and the order of events. Details that investigators believe would be difficult to make up. The truth is that without a body and without living witnesses willing to testify, the Hoffa murder will likely never be definitively solved. 7 years after his disappearance, in 1982, Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead, but his body remains missing, and the case remains technically open. Frank Sheeran's confession provided the most detailed story of what supposedly happened to Jimmy Hoffa. But was it true? Or was it, as some doubters argue, the invention of a dying man looking to secure his legacy and provide for his family? The death of Jimmy Hoffa, whether or not Frank Sheeran actually pulled the trigger, marked the beginning of the end for the world that Sheeran had lived in for decades. The alliance between the Teamsters and organized crime continued through the late 1970s. But federal investigators were closing in, using RICO laws to prosecute mob figures and their associates on racketeering charges. According to Sheeran's confessions, his work as a mob enforcer did not end with Hoffa's murder. In 1979, he supposedly killed Salvatore Bergoglio. Sally Buggs, the same man who had supposedly been in the car with him when they picked up Hoffa in 1975. Bergoglio was suspected of becoming an FBI informant, and the mob had a strict policy regarding informants. They died quickly and without mercy. Bergoglio was shot 5 times on a street in New York City's Little Italy neighborhood. Like Hoffa's disappearance, the murder was never officially solved, though several mob associates were suspected. If Sheeran's claim to have killed Bergoglio is true, it would be a particularly cruel way of cleaning up loose ends, getting rid of one of the few people who could have confirmed what happened to Hoffa. But Sheeran's luck was running out. The FBI had been building cases against Teamsters officials and their mob associates for years. And in July 1980, Sheeran was charged, along with 6 others, with crimes involving links to labor leasing businesses controlled by Eugene Hoffa Sr. of Hackensack, New Jersey. The charges included labor racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud, the kind of financial crimes that RICO laws were designed to prosecute. The case against Sheeran was strong. Investigators had documented his connections to organized crime figures, his role in corrupt Teamsters activities, and his participation in schemes to cheat businesses and workers. Unlike murder charges, which required physical evidence and witnesses to a specific violent act, racketeering charges could be built on patterns of behavior, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. On October 31, 1980 Halloween, perhaps fittingly, Frank Sheeran was found guilty on 11 charges of labor racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 32 years in federal prison, a term that would effectively mean life for a man who was already 60 years old. For Frank Sheeran, prison was a huge fall from power. He had spent decades holding power, getting respect, and moving through the world with the confidence of a man who knew he was protected by some of the most dangerous criminals in America. Now he was just another prisoner with no authority and facing the possibility of dying behind bars. But Sheeran had one final card to play: his health. The years of violence and stress had taken a toll on him. He developed serious medical problems that prison doctors had a hard time managing. His lawyer, Charles Brandt, began filing requests for early release on medical grounds, arguing that Sheeran was too sick to serve his full sentence and was no danger to society. After serving 13 years, less than half of his sentence, Frank Sheeran was granted early parole due to poor health. He was released from federal prison, a broken and smaller man in his early 70s, facing a world that had moved on without him. Freedom for Frank Sheeran brought no comfort. The world he returned to was nothing like the world he had left. His wife had died of cancer while he was in prison, and he had gone to her funeral under guard, one of the few times he had been allowed to leave the prison during his time there. That loss broke him in ways that decades of violence had not. His daughters wanted nothing to do with him. They had grown up knowing their father was involved in organized crime, living with the shame and fear that came with that knowledge. His being in prison had been the final straw. They had moved on with their lives and had no interest in getting back, together with a father who had chosen loyalty to mobsters over loyalty to his family. Sheeran's health continued to get worse. Unable to walk without help, he moved into a nursing home in Westchester, Pennsylvania. The man who had once stood 6 feet 4 inches, tall and scared tough criminals with his physical presence, was now in a wheelchair, depending on nurses for basic care, spending his days in a place that smelled of disinfectant and old age. He was alone. The mob friends who had once valued his services had either died, been put in prison, or forgotten about him. Russell Bufalino, his teacher and protector, had died in 1994 while Sheeran was still in prison. Jimmy Hoffa, the man who had been his closest friend, had been dead for decades, killed, if Sheeran's confession was true, by Sheeran himself. The nursing home became Sheeran's prison, perhaps more suffocating than the actual prison he had left behind. At least in federal prison, he had been among other criminals, men who understood the world he came from. In the nursing home, he was surrounded by elderly people who knew nothing of his past, nurses who saw him as just another dying old man, the heavy weight of his own memories. Sheeran began confessing his sins to a Catholic priest, looking for forgiveness for the sins he had committed over a lifetime of violence. The religious teachings of his childhood, the ideas of sin, confession, and being saved, came flooding back. He wanted to die with his soul clean, to believe that despite everything he had done, there might still be a chance for forgiveness. But confessing to a priest was not enough. Sheeran also wanted to tell his story, to leave some record of the life he had lived, the things he had seen, and the part he had played in some of the most important criminal events of the 20th century. And perhaps though this is just a guess. He wanted to leave some money for the daughters who had rejected him. Then came Charles Brandt, a lawyer who had helped get Sheeran released early. Brandt was fascinated by organized crime and had been working on Teamsters cases for years. He realized that Sheeran had stories that had never been told. Inside knowledge of the mob's takeover of labor unions, details about unsolved murders, and possibly the answer to one of the biggest mysteries in American criminal history. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Brandt suggested a deal. Sheeran would tell his story honestly and completely, and Brandt would write a book based on these confessions. The book would be published after Sheeran's death, protecting him from being charged for any crimes for which the time limit had not run out. And the money from the book would go to Sheeran's family, giving them money he had failed to provide through legal ways. Over the final 5 years of his life, Frank Sheeran sat with Charles Brandt for hundreds of hours, speaking into a tape recorder, telling stories about a life lived in the dark corners of American society. These recording sessions took place in the nursing home, with Sheeran stuck in his bed or wheelchair, his voice getting weaker as his health got worse. The confessions were amazing in their detail and range. Sheeran described his childhood in Pennsylvania, his experiences in World War II, and his introduction to Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa. He talked about specific murders, giving dates, locations, and methods. He described the inner workings of the Teamsters Mob Alliance, explaining how money moved, how decisions were made, and how violence was used to keep control. And he confessed to killing Jimmy Hoffa, describing that hot July afternoon in 1975 with a level of detail that was either a remarkably accurate memory or remarkably effective. Lie. He described the layout of the house, the order of events, the moment when Hoffa realized he had been betrayed, and the cold, mechanical act of pulling the trigger. Brandt was convinced that Sheeran was telling the truth. He had spent enough time with mob figures to know when someone was lying or exaggerating. Sheeran's stories had a realness that felt true. The small details that someone making up a story would be unlikely to include. The emotional distance with which he described terrible acts. The matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting history rather than creating fiction. But Brandt also realized that Sheeran might be adding to certain parts of his story. The claims about killing Joey Gallo seemed doubtful given the physical evidence. The hints about being involved in the Kennedy assassination were impossible to check and might have been Sheeran trying to make himself seem more important. Brandt could not be sure where the truth ended and self-aggrandizement began. According to Brandt, something remarkable happened near the end of Sheeran's life. Sheeran became so troubled by guilt over the Hoffa murder that he essentially committed suicide by starvation. Brandt claims that Sheeran refused to eat, starving himself to death within 6 weeks of his final videotaped confession. Whether this story is accurate, or whether Sheeran simply died from his various illnesses is unclear, but it makes for a powerful ending to the story. The idea that this man who had killed so many people without seeming to feel sorry was ultimately destroyed by guilt over betraying his closest friend. On December 14th, 2003, Frank Sheeran died in the nursing home in Westchester, Pennsylvania. The official cause of death was cancer. He was 83 years old. His body was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, not far from where he had been born more than 8 decades earlier. He died alone, separated from his family, abandoned by the criminal organization he had served for decades, and haunted by memories of the things he had done. If there was any forgiveness in his final years, it came only in the confessions themselves, the act of speaking the truth, even if that truth would be questioned and debated for years to come. The tapes of Sheeran's confessions were locked away, to be released only after his death. Charles Brandt began the process of turning hundreds of hours of recordings into a clear story that would become the book. I Heard You Paint Houses, and Frank Sheeran, in death, would become more famous than he had ever been in life. In 2004, just months after Frank Sheeran's death, Charles Brandt's book, I Heard You Paint Houses, Frank the Irishman Sheeran, and closing the case on Jimmy Hoffa, was published. The book was an instant hit, offering what seemed to be the final answer to one of America's longest-lasting mysteries. Brandt's story was gripping. He wove Sheeran's confessions together with historical facts, creating a picture of a man whose life crossed paths with some of the most important criminal events of the 20th century. The book became a bestseller and got a lot of media attention. Finally, readers thought, we know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. But almost right away, questions started to come up. Journalists, historians, and police officials who had spent years investigating the Hoffa case began looking at Sheeran's claims with doubtful eyes. And what they found troubled them. The argument was about several key questions. Was Frank Sheeran really the busy hitman he claimed to be? Was he even in Detroit on July 30th, 1975? And if he was, did he actually kill Jimmy Hoffa? Or was he just taking credit for a murder someone else did? The backlash against I Heard You Paint Houses was led by journalists and investigators who had been studying the Hoffa case for decades. They knew the evidence very well, and they found many problems with Sheeran's story. Bill Tonelli, writing in Slate magazine, published a harsh review titled The Lies of the Irishman. Tonelli carefully took apart Sheeran's claims, especially about the Joey Gallo murder. He pointed out that every piece of physical evidence and witness testimony went against Sheeran's claim that he was one of the shooters at Umberto's Clam House. Tonelli argued that Sheeran was a daydreamer who had put himself into famous crimes to make himself seem more important. Harvard Law School professor Jack Goldsmith, whose stepfather had been involved in the Teamsters and knew some of the people in Sheeran's story, wrote a long analysis titled Jimmy Hoffa and the Irishman, a true crime story for the New York Review of Books. Goldsmith's review was more careful than Tonelli's, but just as doubtful. He admitted that Sheeran had real connections to organized crime and the Teamsters, but questioned whether those connections meant he was the busy killer that Sheeran claimed to be. Perhaps most damaging were the statements from people who had known Sheeran personally. One friend told investigators he never believed Sheeran killed a fly, suggesting that Sheeran's tough guy reputation was more myth than reality. This description was hard to match with the image of Sheeran as a stone-cold killer who murdered 25 to 30 people. The physical evidence was also a problem. Yes, blood was found in the Detroit house where Sheeran claimed to have killed Hoffa, but DNA testing showed that blood did not belong to Hoffa, while defenders of Sheeran's story pointed out that DNA can break down over 30 years, and that the tested blood might not have been Hoffa's. Doubters argued that the lack of positive DNA evidence seriously weakened the confession. Timing issues made things even more complicated. Sheeran had told two friends before the book was published that he was not in Detroit on July 30th, 1975. These statements, made when Sheeran had no clear reason to lie, contradicted his later confession to Charles Brandt. Why would he deny being in Detroit if he was actually there committing the murder? Critics also noted the financial reason for Sheeran to tell an exciting story. Don Maldia, an investigative journalist who had written a lot about the Hoffa case, said plainly, Sheeran was nearly broke and would be leaving little for his family. This was a cold-hearted attempt to grab money at the end of his life. The book deal offered Sheeran a way to provide for his daughters and leave behind some kind of legacy, creating a powerful reason to exaggerate or make up his role in famous crimes. Even the detail about Hoffa's clothing raised questions. Hoffa showed up at the Machu's Red Fox wearing casual clothes that broke the restaurant's dress code. He was seen waiting in the parking lot and never went inside. This suggested that Hoffa knew the meeting would not actually happen at the restaurant, that he was waiting to be picked up and taken somewhere else. But Sheeran's story did not quite fit with this evidence, suggesting either gaps in his knowledge or mistakes in his confession. Despite the skepticism, Frank Sheeran's confession had significant support from some credible sources. The case for Sheeran's credibility rested on several key points. First, the FBI clearly took Sheeran seriously as a suspect. The 1976 Hoffa's memo, put together just 1 year after Hoffa's disappearance, listed Sheeran as a prime suspect. This judgment was made when memories were fresh and when investigators had access to information that might not have been available to later critics. The FBI did not list Sheeran as a suspect because they read about him in a book. They identified him based on their own investigation. Second, Rudy Giuliani's inclusion of Sheeran on his 1985 list of top mob figures was significant. Giuliani was one of the most aggressive prosecutors of organized crime in American history, and his list represented the federal government's assessment of who truly mattered in the mafia hierarchy. To be named as one of only 2 non-Italians on that list meant that federal law enforcement viewed Sheeran as a significant criminal figure, not a low-level nobody puffing up his importance. Third, Sheeran knew details about the Detroit house that would have been difficult to make up. While he might have gotten some information from news reports or books about the Hoffa case, his description of the house's layout and location proved accurate when investigators checked. As one investigator noted, killers may not remember exact addresses, but they never forget how they got there and what they did when they arrived. Fourth, the presence of blood in the house. Even blood that was not definitively matched to Hoffa suggested that violence had occurred there. The pattern of blood splatter was consistent with the shooting. While this does not prove Hoffa was killed there, it certainly does not disprove it. Fifth, Sheeran had no apparent reason to confess to a murder that would bring shame to his family and confirm his status as a killer. If his goal was simply to make money, he could have written a book without confessing to murdering Hoffa. He could have presented himself as a witness to mob activities rather than a participant in murder. The fact that he specifically claimed to have killed his closest friend and described feeling tormented by that act suggested a certain authenticity to the confession. Finally, there was the question of who else could have done it. Federal investigators had identified a small circle of suspects who had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Hoffa. If Sheeran did not do it, who did? And why would those other suspects allow Sheeran to take credit for a murder they committed? The truth, as is often the case with mob murders, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle ground between complete truth and complete fabrication. Sheeran was almost certainly involved in organized crime and committed acts of violence. He probably did have access to information about Hoffa's murder, whether or not he actually pulled the trigger himself. And he likely exaggerated some aspects of his criminal career while being truthful about others. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from acknowledging the limits of what we can know. Without physical evidence, without living witnesses willing to testify, without Hoffa's body, the complete truth about what happened on July 30th, 1975 may never be known with certainty. Frank Sheeran's confession provided one version of events, a version that might be substantially true, partially true, or elaborately false. We simply cannot know for sure. In 2019, 15 years after the publication of I Heard You Paint Houses, director Martin Scorsese brought Frank Sheeran's story to the screen in the film The Irishman. The movie was a remarkable success. Scorsese reunited with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, actors who had defined the gangster movie in films like Goodfellas and Casino, and added Al Pacino in his first movie with Scorsese. As Jimmy Hoffa, the film premiered at the New York Film Festival on September 27, 2019, and was released in theaters on November 1st before streaming on Netflix later that month. With a budget of about $159 million, much of it spent on new de-aging technology that allowed the actors to play their characters across many decades. The Irishman was one of the most expensive films ever made for a streaming service. Scorsese's film had a sad and thoughtful tone, very different from the fast energy of his earlier gangster films. The Irishman was a deep thought on aging, regret, and the final emptiness of a life lived for violence and loyalty. De Niro's portrayal of Sheeran was quiet and sad, showing the mental cost of decades of killing rather than the glamour or excitement of mob life. The film's big final scene, the murder of Hoffa, was shot with plain simplicity. No dramatic music, no fancy camera work, just a quiet house, a moment of realization, and then violence. Scorsese's directing showed the boringness of murder, the way it had become a routine for Sheeran, with no emotional feeling. The Irishman received great reviews. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Scorsese, and Best Supporting Actor for both Pacino and Pesci. While it did not win any Oscars, the film was recognized as a masterpiece of American cinema, a worthy final piece to Scorsese's decades-long study of organized crime and its effect on American society. But the film also started the debate again about whether Frank Sheeran's story was true. When asked directly if it mattered if the portrayal was accurate, Scorsese gave a telling answer. "I don't really care about that. The point is, it's not about the facts." For Scorsese, The Irishman was not a documentary or a historical reenactment. It was a work of art that used Sheeran's story to explore bigger ideas about loyalty, aging, regret, and the American experience. Whether Sheeran actually killed Hoffa was, from Scorsese's point of view, less important than what the story revealed about human nature and the consequences of choosing a life of crime. This artistic approach frustrated critics who were concerned about historical accuracy. They argued that by treating Sheeran's confession as if it were definitively true, the film was spreading what might be an elaborate lie. They worried that millions of viewers would accept the film's version of events without understanding the significant doubts about Sheeran's credibility. But defenders of the film argued that audiences are smart enough to understand the difference between a dramatic story and a historical document. The Irishman was clearly labeled as being based on a book rather than claiming to be the definitive true story. And regardless of factual accuracy, the film worked as a powerful meditation on themes that go beyond any single historical event. The debate about The Irishman mirrored the larger debate about Frank Sheeran himself. How much does literal truth matter? Can a story be artistically or thematically true, even if its specific factual claims are questionable? And how do we navigate the complicated territory between documented history and a compelling story? Trying to understand the real Frank Sheeran, not the legend, not the Hollywood version, but the actual human being, requires dealing with contradictions and accepting that we do not know everything. By all accounts, Sheeran was genuinely a truck driver who got involved with organized crime through connections in the trucking industry. This much is documented and not argued. He did hold a leadership position in a Teamsters local, though how much power and influence he had is debated. He was investigated by federal authorities and eventually convicted of using the union for crime. This, too, is a matter of public record. The psychological picture that comes from his life story is complex. Sheeran seems to have been someone who was shaped by childhood trauma, those boxing matches with his father, and by the extreme violence of World War II combat. He served an extraordinary number of days in combat, and by his own account, participated in war crimes, including the execution of prisoners. This experience would have fundamentally changed his mind, creating a person capable of violence without the normal emotional barriers that prevent most people from killing. In the world of crime, Sheeran found a place where his ability for violence was valued rather than condemned. He formed real relationships, especially with Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa. It seemed to matter to him, even as he committed terrible acts for those relationships. The fact that he was apparently tormented by guilt over killing Hoffa but not over his other murders, suggests a complicated moral system in which personal betrayal was worse than murder itself. Sheeran's religious background added another layer of complexity. He was raised Catholic, went to confession, and in his final years sought forgiveness from a priest. This suggests that despite decades of killing, some part of him still believed in the ideas of sin and redemption that he had learned as a child. He wanted to believe that even the worst acts could be forgiven, that even a life lived in darkness could be saved in the end. His separation from his daughters reveals the personal cost of his choices. These were people who should have been his main loyalty, yet he chose the mob over his family. The fact that they wanted nothing to do with him in his final years suggests that the damage he caused went far beyond his murder victims to include the people who had his name and lived with the shame of being connected to him. The question of whether Sheeran was a busy hitman or a minor criminal who exaggerated his importance cannot be definitively answered. The evidence suggests he was somewhere in between, probably more important than critics claim, but less important than he portrayed himself. He was likely involved in some violent crimes, possibly including murders, but probably did not commit all the killings he claimed. What seems clear is that Frank Sheeran was a man destroyed by violence. Violence he experienced as a child, violence he participated in during war, and violence he inflicted for profit in his adult life. Whether he killed Jimmy Hoffa or not, his life stands as a warning story about the corruption of human potential and the way violence, once accepted, becomes impossible to escape. Despite Frank Sheeran's detailed confession, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is still officially unsolved. The FBI has never closed the case, and tips continued to come in decades after that July afternoon in 1975. Over the years, many theories have been suggested about what happened to Hoffa and where his body might be located. Investigators have dug up sites across the Midwest based on informant tips and supposed witness stories. They have dug up backyards in suburban Detroit, searched under a swimming pool, and even examined Giant Stadium in New Jersey, now torn down, based on a long-running rumor that Hoffa was buried under the end zone during construction. None of these searches have found any physical evidence of Hoffa's body. His body, if there is a body to find, has been hidden so well that decades of investigation by the world's top law enforcement agency have failed to find it. The lasting mystery of Hoffa's disappearance points to something deeper than just one man's fate. It represents a time when the power of the criminal world was still strong enough to make a famous person vanish without a trace. It reminds us that for all our investigation technology and forensic skills, some secrets stay buried. Theories continue to spread. Some investigators believe Hoffa was killed in Michigan, and his body was taken to a mob-connected disposal site, possibly crushed in a car compactor, possibly burned in an industrial furnace, or possibly dissolved in acid or lye. Others think he might have been taken out of state, perhaps to New Jersey, where mob figures had access to many disposal options. A few lone investigators continue to insist that Hoffa was not killed by the mob at all, that he is still alive somewhere, and that his disappearance was an elaborate fake. These theories are on the edge of what is believable, accepted mainly by conspiracy theorists, who are unwilling to accept the obvious conclusion that Hoffa was murdered by organized crime figures who decided he had become too dangerous to be allowed to live. The FBI's official position is that they have strong theories about what happened, but not enough evidence to bring charges. They believe they know who ordered the hit, who participated in it, and approximately where it took place. But belief and proof are different things, and in the American justice system, proof is what matters. In 2021, long after Sheeran's death, the FBI conducted another search related to the Hoffa case, this time at a property in New Jersey. Once again, the search came up empty. The mystery continues. For the Hoffa family, the lack of an answer has been a long and painful process. Jimmy Hoffa's son James P. Hoffa followed in his father's footsteps and eventually became president of the Teamsters himself, serving from 1999 to 2022. He has spoken in public about the pain of never knowing exactly what happened to his father, never having a grave to visit, and never having the certainty that would allow the family to fully grieve and move on. The Hoffa case has become more than just an unsolved murder. It has become a symbol of an entire era of American history, a time when organized crime had enormous power, when labor unions were both vital forces for workers' rights and tools for corruption, and when the line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was often impossible to see. And Frank Sheeran, whether he actually pulled the trigger or not, has become forever linked to this mystery. His name will always be associated with Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, and the debates about his credibility will continue as long as people remain fascinated by this dark chapter of American history. The story of Frank the Irishman Sheeran forces us to face uncomfortable truths about American society and human nature. It is a story that does not have simple moral conclusions and is hard to put in a single category. On one level, it is a crime story, a tale of murder, corruption, and betrayal set during organized crime's golden age. But it is also a story about social class and limited opportunities, about how working-class men with few legal paths to success could be tempted by the money and power that crime offered. Sheeran's journey from working-class Pennsylvania to the top of mob power shows how America's strict class system created paths into organized crime. For men like Sheeran, the American dream, the promise that hard work and determination could lead to success and wealth, was largely out of reach through legal means. The mob offered another path, one that promised wealth and respect to men who were willing to use violence for criminal businesses. His story is also about loyalty and its limits. Sheeran's entire criminal career was built on loyalty. Loyalty to Russell Bufalino, loyalty to Jimmy Hoffa, and loyalty to the code of organized crime. It demanded silence and punished betrayal with death. But in the end, Sheeran's loyalty to the organization required him to betray the person he was closest to. This contradiction, that true loyalty to the mob required the ultimate, personal betrayal, reveals the moral emptiness at the heart of organized crime. The war in Sheeran's background is key to understanding his story. World War II created millions of veterans who had been trained to kill and had experienced the mental trauma of combat. Most of these men returned to civilian life and became productive citizens, turning their experiences into positive things. But some, like Sheeran, found that the ability for violence they had developed serving their country could be used to make money serving criminal organizations. This raises troubling questions about how society treats its veterans and how combat trauma can show up in destructive ways. Sheeran received no psychological help after the war, no support in processing what he had experienced and done. He was simply expected to return to normal life, as if years of killing had not fundamentally changed who he was. The corruption of labor unions is another key theme. The Teamsters, under leaders like Jimmy Hoffa, were supposed to represent working people and fight for their rights. Instead, they became tools for organized crime to take wealth and use power. This betrayal of the labor movement's ideals had effects that went far beyond the direct victims of mob violence. It weakened public support for unions in general and contributed to their decline in the later decades of the 20th century. The question of truth and believability that surrounds Sheeran's confessions reflects larger issues about how we understand history. We want definite answers, clear stories that explain complex events. But real history is messy, contradictory, and often impossible to fully put back together. We are left with competing stories, incomplete evidence, and the realization that some things simply cannot be known for sure. Sheeran's story also shines a light on the nature of American power. The fact that a truck driver could become a significant figure in both labor unions and organized crime reveals how blurry the lines were between legal and criminal power structures. Politicians, businessmen, union officials, and mobsters all worked in overlapping areas, making deals and forming alliances that served their mutual interests at the expense of ordinary citizens. Finally, Sheeran's story is a reflection on aging, regret, and the search for forgiveness. The image of an elderly man in a nursing home, abandoned by his family, seeking forgiveness for a lifetime of violence. This is not the glamorous vision of mob life shown in much of popular culture. It is a reminder that choices have consequences, that a life built on violence ultimately leaves nothing but emptiness and regret. Whether Frank Sheeran actually killed Jimmy Hoffa may never be known with certainty. But his story, true in its general outline even if debated in its specific claims, offers valuable insights into a particular time and place in American history. It shows us the dark side of the American dream, the corruption of institutions that were supposed to serve the public good, and the human capacity for both violence and self-deception. In the final analysis, Frank the Irishman Sheeran remains a puzzle, a figure whose true nature is hidden by layers of myth, exaggeration, conflicting stories, and the passage of time. Was he the stone-cold killer who murdered dozens of people, including one of the most famous men in America? Was he a minor criminal who made up a dramatic story to secure his family's financial future? Or was he something in between, a genuine mob associate who committed some violent acts but exaggerated the extent of his criminality? The evidence supports all three interpretations to some degree, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Frank Sheeran exists more as a symbol than as a historical figure, a symbol of mob violence, of betrayal, of the corruption that infected American institutions in the mid-20th century, and of the ultimately destructive nature of a life lived outside the law. His confession to killing Jimmy Hoffa, whether true or false, provided a narrative ending to one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. It gave people an answer, even if that answer cannot be definitively verified. In a culture that craves resolution and dislikes uncertainty, Sheeran's confession served a psychological need, regardless of its factual accuracy. The fascination with Frank Sheeran's story reveals something about our collective psychology. We are drawn to stories about organized crime because they represent a world where power is used directly, where conflicts are resolved through force, and where the rules that limit ordinary people do not apply. There is a vicarious thrill in learning about this hidden world, even as we recognize its brutality and moral bankruptcy. But the most powerful aspect of Sheeran's story may be its ending, not the dramatic confession about killing Hoffa, but the quiet tragedy of his final years. Here was a man who had held genuine power, who had moved through the world with confidence and authority, who had been feared and respected by dangerous men. And he ended his life alone in a nursing home, separated from his family, abandoned by his former associates, and tormented by memories of the things he had done. This is the real cost of a life of crime, not traumatic shootouts or long prison sentences, but the slow accumulation of broken relationships, violated trust, and moral compromise. It is the recognition, too late to change anything, that the power and money and respect were illusions, and that the only things that truly matter, family, genuine human connection, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror without shame, were sacrificed for nothing. Frank Sheeran died as he had lived, caught between competing loyalties, unable to find redemption, carrying secrets that would die with him. His confession may have provided some relief, some sense that he had finally told the truth, but it also sparked decades of controversy and debate that will likely never be fully resolved. In the end, perhaps the most honest thing we can say about Frank the Irishman Sheeran is this: he was a man shaped by violence, who spent his life inflicting violence on others, who developed relationships that mattered to him, even as he betrayed them, who sought meaning and loyalty in organizations that had no loyalty to him, and who ultimately discovered, too late, that the price of his choices was everything that makes life worth living. Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. The truth about his murder may never be definitively established. Frank Sheeran's confessions will continue to be debated by historians, journalists, and amateur detectives for generations to come. But what is certain is this. On a hot July afternoon in 1975, one of the most powerful men in America climbed into the back seat of a maroon Mercury and was never seen again. Whether Frank Sheeran pulled the trigger or not, someone did. And that person, along with everyone who planned, helped, and covered up the murder, represents the dark heart of American organized crime in its most powerful era. Frank Sheeran's story is over. He died in 2003, and whatever secrets he took to his grave are gone forever. But the questions his confessions raised will endure, and the mystery at the center of his story, what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa, continues to fascinate and perplex us. In the long story of American crime, Frank Sheeran holds a unique position, at the same time central and on the sidelines, at the same time believable and questionable, at the same time a key witness and a possible liar. He was there in the rooms where decisions were made and in the streets where those decisions were carried out. He knew the people, witnessed the events, and participated in at least some of the violence. But how much of what he told us was true? And how much was the self-serving myth of a dying man trying to secure his legacy? We may never know. And perhaps, in the end, that is the perfect metaphor for the world Frank Sheeran lived in, a world of shadows and secrets, where truth and lies were deliberately confused, where nothing was quite as it seemed, and where the most important questions were designed never to be answered. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains open. As of this writing, no one has been charged with his murder, and his body has never been recovered. Frank Sheeran's confession remains one of many theories about what happened on July 30th, 1975, a theory that some find compelling and others find unbelievable, but that no one can definitively prove or disprove. This is the nature of mob secrets. They remain secret even when someone claims to reveal them. The truth stays buried, and all we have are stories that may be true, may be false, or maybe something in between. And there you have it. The complete, true story of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a working-class kid from Pennsylvania who became a decorated war veteran, a truck driver, a union official, a mob enforcer, and possibly, just possibly, the man who solved America's greatest unsolved mystery by pulling the trigger on Jimmy Hoffa. But here's the thing. After spending these hours together, diving deep into every aspect of Sheeran's life, examining the evidence from every angle, and exploring the controversy that still rages decades after his death, you still have to make up your own mind. Did Frank Sheeran really kill Jimmy Hoffa? Think about everything you have just heard. The FBI listed him as a prime suspect within a year of Hoffa's disappearance, not because they read a book decades later, but because their own investigation pointed to him. Rudy Giuliani, one of the most aggressive mob prosecutors in American history, named him as one of only 2 non-Italians important enough to make his list of 26 top organized crime figures. Blood was found in the house where Sheeran claimed the murder took place. Blood splatter consistent with a shooting. But then consider the other side. The DNA from that blood did not match Hoffa's. Witnesses at the Joey Gallo murder scene never described anyone matching Sheeran's imposing 6'4" frame. Some people who knew him claimed he never killed a fly, and he had every financial incentive to tell a sensational story that would secure money for his estranged family. So, what do you believe? Here is what I think makes this story so interesting. It does not matter if we can prove every detail beyond a reasonable doubt. What matters is that Frank Sheeran's life whether he was the busy hitman he claimed to be or a minor player who exaggerated his role, tells us something profound about America in the mid-20th century. It tells us about how war can transform ordinary people into killers. It reveals how organized crime snuck into institutions that were supposed to protect working people. It shows us how loyalty can become a weapon, how friendship can be put second to business, and how power corrupts everything it touches. I want to hear from you. After spending these hours diving deep into Frank Sheeran's life and the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, what do you think? Do you believe Frank Sheeran killed Jimmy Hoffa? Was he the stone-cold hitman who murdered his best friend on orders from Russell Bufalino? Or was he a dying man spinning one last tale to leave something behind for his family? Drop your theory in the comments below. Tell me what convinced you. Was it the FBI's inclusion of him as a suspect? The blood evidence in the Detroit house? Or are you skeptical? Do you think someone else pulled the trigger? Or that Sheeran was nowhere near Detroit that day? I read every single comment, and I love debating these theories with you. Some of the most interesting insights I have found have come from viewers who noticed details I missed or brought perspectives I had not considered. This community of true crime fans and history buffs is incredible, and your thoughts genuinely matter. If you made it this far, and let's be honest, you have just invested several hours of your life in this story, then you are exactly the kind of person I create this content for. You appreciate deep dives. You love exploring the complex moral landscape of true crime. You understand that the most fascinating stories are the ones that do not offer easy answers. So here's what I need you to do. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this is just the beginning. The world of organized crime is filled with stories as compelling as Frank Sheeran's, stories of power and betrayal, of rise and fall, of loyalty tested and broken. Give this video a like if you found it valuable. The algorithm needs to know that deep, thoughtful, true crime content matters. That viewers want more than just shallow coverage of these complex stories. Your like tells YouTube that this kind of comprehensive storytelling deserves to reach more people. Share this video with anyone in your life who loves true crime, unsolved mysteries, or American history. This is the kind of story people discuss for hours, debating the evidence and exploring the implications. It is perfect for true crime fans, history buffs, or anyone fascinated by the intersection of crime, labor, and American power. Now, I want to hear from you about something else. What gangster story should I cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Tell me whose story you want to hear next. What mysteries do you want me to investigate? What figures from the criminal underworld fascinate you? Your input directly shapes the content I create, and I love taking on the challenges you throw at me. Before you go, I want to leave you with something to think about. Frank Sheeran died alone in a nursing home, estranged from his daughters, abandoned by the organization he had served for decades, and haunted by memories of the things he had done. He had accumulated no wealth, built no lasting relationships, and created no legacy beyond the violence he inflicted and the controversy his confession sparked. He gained power and lost everything that mattered. That is the real lesson of the Irishman, not whether he killed Jimmy Hoffa, but what his life cost him. It is a reminder that the choices we make define us, that loyalty can be weaponized against us, and that some prices are too high to pay, regardless of what we get in return. So as you go about your life, making your own choices about loyalty, ambition, and what you are willing to compromise to achieve your goals, remember Frank Sheeran. Remember that the glamour of the mob life, the power, the money, the respect, was ultimately an illusion that left nothing but emptiness and regret. Thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring one of the most fascinating and controversial stories in American criminal history. Whether you believe every word of Sheeran's confession or think it was complete fiction. I hope this deep dive gave you new insights, raised interesting questions, and provided a comprehensive look at a man whose life embodied the dark side of the American dream. Your engagement, your comments, your likes, your shares is what makes this channel possible. It is what allows me to spend weeks researching these stories and hours scripting them to give you the most complete, accurate, and thought-provoking content I can create. The truth about Frank Sheeran may be forever buried with Jimmy Hoffa, but the conversation about what his story means, about loyalty and betrayal, about power and corruption, about the cost of violence and the search for redemption, that conversation continues with you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for engaging. And remember, in the world Frank Sheeran inhabited, when it is time for you to go, they send your best friend. Sleep well.